Stirrings. Although the moon was only 3/4 full, it cast such a bright sheen upon the river's surface that the water seemed to be glowing from within. Although the night was cool, there was no wind and not a sound was to be heard from the shores. Turning over in a drowsy discomfort, Pia adjusted the sari that was her pillow and found her head resting against the boat's wooden prow. Her sleep was suddenly interrupted by the sound of a great bustle, a restless scraping, scratching noise with echoing through the timber, percolating up from the boat's bowels. It took a few minutes for Pia to work out that this was merely the sound of the boat's live cargo of crabs scurrying about in the hold. She could hear the rattle of their shells, the clattering of their claws, and the rustling of leaves and branches. It was as though she were a giant listening to the stirrings of a subterranean city. The boat rocked as if under the shifting of someone's weight, and she glanced down to see that Fokir was sitting up in the center of the craft, with a blanket draped tent-like around his shoulders. She had thought him to be asleep under the shelter, but there was a boulder-like immobility about him that suggested he had been sitting there for some time. He seemed to feel the touch of her gaze, for he turned to look in her direction, and when he saw she was awake, gave her a smile that was both apologetic and self-mocking. It warmed her to think of him sitting there keeping watch as she and Turul slept. She remembered the moment when his hand had touched her in the water and how violently she had tried to fight it off until she understood it was not a predator that had touched her, but a human being, someone she could trust, someone who would not hurt her. In remembering this, she was amazed to think that no more than a few hours had passed since she had tumbled out of that launch and into the water. The memory caused a tremor to shake her body, and when she shut her eyes, it was as if the water had closed around her again and she was back in those swift, eerily glowing depths where the sunlight had no orientation, and it was impossible to know which way was up and which down. She felt the boat move under her and realized she was shivering. She was trying to calm herself, taking one deep breath after another, when suddenly she felt a firm, cool touch on her shoulder, and this too was strangely reminiscent of her fall, for she knew it was Fakir. Opening her eyes, she saw he was looking weirdly into her face, and she tried to force a smile. But it turned into a grimace, for her body would not stop its convulsive shaking. She could feel his anxiety deepening now, so she placed her hand on his and he took hold of it and stretched himself out beside her. His salty, sun-soaked smell was in her nostrils now, and through the blanket that separated them she could feel the sharpness of his ribs. His body seemed to warm her coverings, dissipating the clammy sensation that had seized her limbs. When her shivering had stopped, she sat up abruptly, in embarrassment. She sprang back at the same time, and she knew he was just as discomfited as she was. She wished she could think of a way to let him know that it was all right. Nothing had been misunderstood. No wrong had been done. But all she could do was clear her throat noisily and say thank you. Then mercifully, as if to rescue them from the awkwardness of the moment, Tutul cried out in his sleep. Immediately Fokir slid away to comfort his son. Pia lowered her head again to the bunched-up sari she was using as a pillow, and it seemed to her now that in the folds of the fabric she could smell the presence of the garment's owner. It was almost as if the other woman had suddenly materialized in the boat. Pia was glad to think she could have said to her exactly what she had said to Fokir, that no wrong had been done and nothing at all had happened. What could have happened anyway? Although she knew little else about Fokir, she did know he had a child and was married. And as for herself, no thought was farther from her mind than the idea of a personal entanglement. She was out on assignment, working in the field, It was the exclusion of intimate involvements that made a place into a field, and the line between the two was marked by a taboo she could not cross, except at the risk of betraying her vocation. The boat was already moving when Pia woke next morning. She opened her eyes to find that a dense fog had resulted from the collision between the cold night air and the water's warmth. She could not see much beyond her own feet, and her blankets were wet with dew. It was only because of a faint glow in the eastern sky that she knew that the sun had risen. It astonished her that Fakir could steer in such bad light. Clearly he knew this stretch of water well enough to feel his way along the river's edge. There was no pressing reason to get up, so she allowed herself to fall back into a doze. In a while the boat came to a stop, waking her again. She looked up to find that the fog was still thick around the boat, and nothing could be seen of the surrounding terrain. There was a sound astern as of an anchor dropping, and she wondered idly why Fakir had chosen to stop here. She decided it must have something to do with the visibility. Perhaps they had reached a stretch of open water where it would be impossible to steer in the fog. She was about to drop off again when she heard something that made her sit upright. Cupping her hands around her ears, she listened hard, and there it was again, a rippling in the water followed by a muffled snort, as if a man were blowing his nose into a thick wad of Kleenex. Shit! She sprang into a kneeling position and listened carefully, turning her ears to the fog. A few minutes of close attention was all it took to know that there were several dolphins in the vicinity of the boat. The sounds were scattered in direction and seemed to change location frequently. Some were faint and far away, while others were close at hand. She had spent great lengths of time listening to these muffled grunts and knew exactly what they were. Only the Irrawaddy dolphin, Oricella breviratris, produced this particular kind of sound. Evidently, a group of traveling Oricella had decided to make a brief halt near the boat. It was typical of her luck that this had happened at a time when she could not see beyond her arm. From her experience of such encounters, she knew that the dolphins would become restless in a matter of minutes. They would probably be gone again before she could unpack her equipment. Fakir! She said his name in an urgent whisper to make sure he had heard the sounds. The boat rocked, and she knew from its motion that he was working his way forward, but he still startled her when he emerged from the fog. His head seemed to be floating on a cloud, with tendrils of mist swirling around his neck. Listen, she cried, holding a hand to her ear, pointing in the direction of the exhalations. He nodded, but without showing any surprise. It was as though there were nothing unexpected about this encounter, and he had known all along that they would be there. Could it be that this was the spot he had been aiming for the night before with the idea of showing her the dolphins? This baffled her still more. How could he have known that they would run into a group of Orcella right then and right in that place? It was possible, of course, that the dolphins frequented this stretch of water, but even so, how could he have known that they would be there on that day, at that time? Groups of migrating Orcella were anything but predictable in their movements. She decided to shrug off these questions for the time being. The job at hand was to record all the data that could be conjured out of this fog. Despite the urgency of the moment, Pia's movements were unhurried and methodical as she went about the business of unpacking her equipment. Just as she was fixing a sheaf of data sheets into her clipboard, a dolphin surfaced a meter away. It was so close she could feel the spray from its breath. She caught sight of a dorsal fin and bluntly rounded snout. There was no further room for doubt now that these were definitely Orcella. Although she had been almost sure from the start, it was still good to have visual confirmation. The animal had surfaced so close to the boat that she had only to extend her arm to get a reading on the GPS monitor. She recorded the figures with a sense of triumph. Even if the dolphins took flight this very minute, this little scrap of data would have made the encounter credible and worthwhile. By this time, the fog had thinned, and with the tide at its lowest ebb, the shore was revealed to be no more than a few hundred meters away. Pia saw that Fokir had stopped the boat at a point where the shore curved like the inside of an arm, creating a long patch of unperturbed water in the crook of the river's elbow. It was evident also that the boat was anchored in the only remaining stretch of deep water. This consisted of a boomeranging-shaped area about a kilometer in length. It was in this stretch that the dolphins were circling, as if within the limits of an invisible pool. Soon the dawn fog was as distant a memory as the chill of the night. With the mud banks and the forest holding back the wind, no breeze could find its way down to the water. In the stillness, the river seemed to give birth to a second sun, so that there was almost as much heat radiating from the water's surface as from the cloudless sky above. As the temperature peaked, subterranean currents of life rose seething to the surface of the nearby mud banks, with legions of crabs scuttling to salvage the rich haul of leaves and other debris left behind by the retreating tide. By midday, Pia had enough data to make an informed guess about the size of the group. There were 7 individuals, she estimated, but this included a pair that appeared to be swimming in tandem, usually surfacing together. One of these was smaller in size than the other animals, and she knew this to be a calf. Probably a newborn, yet too young to swim independently of its mother. Time and again she observed it coming to the surface in a corkscrew pattern, with its little head protruding from the water, an indication that it had still to learn to breathe smoothly. Her heart leapt every time she caught sight of that little head. It was exhilarating to know that the population was still reproducing. Rarely, if ever, did the animals venture away from the bend in the river. They seemed instead to be content to circle within that small stretch of deep water. Nor was it the boat's presence that kept them there. Whatever interest they had in it had long since been exhausted. Why were they lingering? What had brought them here, and what were they waiting for? It was all very confusing, and yet Pia knew intuitively that something interesting was going on, something that might be important to the understanding of the Irrawaddy dolphin and its patterns of behavior. She just had to puzzle out what it was.